Hi everyone, and very welcome to this second learning series on cash and anticipatory action. I think we'll just give another minute because I can see people are coming in slowly now. So hang in here and we are gonna get started in a few short seconds. Daniel, just checking if you're with us and if you want to open the meeting today.
Good. Yes, Maja, I would love to. I see we are a minute past time. I don't know whether we should give a minute or two, or we just start now.
I think we can get started because we do have a little bit of practical in the beginning anyway. So I think people will join us as they in their meetings coming right before this. So I'll just take you to the practical slide. Remember to mention translation, and then we'll dive into it. Over to you, Daniel.
All right. Good afternoon, good morning, colleagues and friends. I hope all we are well. I know it's been quite a busy afternoon, especially for those that are within the African region with the meetings. So this session, I would, we can ask people to just write your name and then possibly your title against your name on the on this platform, so that then we get to know who is in. But I also want to take this opportunity to introduce the facilitators of the session. Maja being the lead facilitators, we have Phoebe, and of course we have our colleagues from Kenya Red Cross, Peter Murgol. So I'll be giving them an opportunity to then take lead. But before that, I just want to mention that series that we started last week. Is it last week? Last week, part 1. And the reasoning behind this is that we've seen from the roadmap, Africa roadmap, that most of our national societies are actually looking at cash, and also all those countries that are also implementing the eco PPP. We've seen a lot of this support, and it is at that basis that we also want to then recognize and ensure then we are all at the same level, and ensure then people understand how then this complement or work. We should work together to ensure that we understand the same on the same platform. So with that, I would also request people to ensure that they're muted unless you speaking. And then at this point, then I'll ask Maja to take over to then take the next session. Over to you, Maja.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And there's translation available. So do go in and choose to put on translation to French if you need it. And our translators are ready to translate everything for you. So throughout the meeting, please, as always, put your questions in the chat as well. We'd like to hear from you, and we will do our very best to find time for the Q&A today, which we missed last time. So last time, as Daniel said, we did go through the theoretical stuff. Today it's cash and early action. We have Kenya and Bangladesh colleagues coming and sharing their examples with us, and then we will go through the draft for imminent crisis in the last session, which we will be having Tuesday next week. So we hope again to see many of you in that session. For today, we're just opening. I'll do a very, very quick intro to social protection. The point is not for us to go too much in depth here, but we cannot ignore that there are very clear linkages between anticipatory action and social protection already, and with an increased use of cash and social protection as well. Of course, there is an obvious linkage back to what we're doing here also. Phoebe will take us through the early action protocols. What are the steps and where can cash be included in these? And then we have the case studies. So we have Peter Morgul from Kenya Red Cross, and we have Kairul from, well, German Red Cross, but supporting in Bangladesh, and my counterpart there, Michael, as well, supporting to share the experiences from Bangladesh. We know it's outside the region, but they have very good experiences on cash in early action. So we'd love to hear from them and get some inspiration. And then we'll have Q&A, we'll close and we'll link you up to the resources that we have to share. We did ask you last time to prepare a bit of homework for the session today. And it's not because we are going to go through all the examples, but we would really like to hear from you if you've been home and had a think about this. And the question was, in the last emergency response that you were engaged in, if you could go back, would anticipatory action using a cash modality have been relevant, and how would you have done it? So please share with us if you've had a chance to think about this or have a quick response to it. You can put that directly in the chat, or also feel very welcome to actually put it directly in a Google Doc that we have prepared. And I'll just put the link in the chat. So feel free to open that. You can also put your questions in there. But again, if you want to just use the chat, we're very happy with that. We'll manage and put all these documents over on the Google Doc as well. All right. So very quickly, as I said, just a few words on the linkages that we see to social protection, because we find this important and necessary when we are talking about anticipatory action and cash. So overall, remember that social protection programs are typically a responsibility of governments, but we've seen a humanitarian interest in, of course, supporting crisis-prone populations through predictable and sustainable support, growing steadily for the last maybe 30, 40 years. And during the COVID crisis, this surged dramatically. And the ambition with having social protection systems and with humanitarian actors more and more linking into these is to make sure that we have safety nets programming that enable people to become more self-reliant while they don't fall into further poverty, of course, as a result of crisis. So if we look at it generally, social protection, the definition is a set of policies and programs that provide cash or in-kind support to help people manage risks by smoothing consumptions. So we talked about this last time, for example, by protecting their assets. And we hopefully through that help prevent the adoption of negative risk coping strategies and the empowering impacts. Very straightforward definition on that. It prevents and it protects people against poverty, vulnerability, and social exclusion. And the whole idea with social protection programs is often to look at this throughout a life cycle approach, and of course, focusing on the most vulnerable groups. A lot of social protection programs already use cash, and around the world, we see at least 222 countries that have some kind of social protection program. So we get up in the billions of people who are supported through social protection. And in response to COVID specifically, as I said, that really increased the number of governments also investing in social protection. And we saw 734 yes, new cash schemes that started in more than 180 countries that were just social protection related. So besides that, of course, we had all the humanitarian assistance that were still being provided outside of social protection. It's just to give a good idea about how much increase we also saw in cash embedded in social protection during COVID. What we really want to look at is the shock responsive social protection. That's where the most natural link is for humanitarian actors, linking into whether a government has already set up a shock responsive social protection system, or whether we can help them make their social protection systems more shock responsive and climate sensitive for that matter. And it's really important that we keep in mind that across Africa, a robust social protection system is generally not the norm. We have a lot of countries that barely have anything in place, or they only have something small scale in place, or maybe it's not that thorough. So it's really important for the audience that we're sitting with here to think about how can we adapt the way that we work with social protection in the specific country context that we're in, depending on what's already in place, or what is the government and what is development actors already planning. If we can work with shock responsive and climate sensitive social protection systems, we mean to work with social protection systems that are designed to respond to covariate shocks, so those that suddenly come in and affect a wider number of households than those that are typically in need in a specific area. So especially when we see, for example, our droughts, floods, conflicts, cyclones, etc. And it means that that there is a social protection program in place that can be scaled up rapidly. So typically we say vertically first, and secondly horizontally. And I'll give you a little bit more info on what that looks like. Overall, if we look at social protection programs, we see two sides. So there's the non-contributory and there's a contributory areas of this. So contributory is, for example, social insurance, where people have to pay in something themselves to get something back. We also have social protection matters happening on labor market policies, for example, enabling people to access trainings and jobs and so on. And then we have the non-contributory side of things, which is where we would typically be looking at working, which is the transfers. So the obvious one for cash, where we see either cash, vouchers, in-kind, school feeding as well is happening under that. Cash for work and food for work, so like public works areas. Again, we also see a lot of cash for work, so easy to link. Then there are other areas, so fee waivers and subsidies, which are more directly linked into what the governments are doing. And then increasingly, we do also see, especially when working with anticipatory action, that humanitarian actors are also working more on the insurance side of things, trying to figure out how can we put in climate insurances where people are either supported directly to access those, for example, by organizations contributing to these insurances, or by linking people up to insurance schemes, for example, within our livelihoods programs, where they themselves are responsible for the contributory part. When we overall look at how are we working with social protection in CBA, we have different areas. So the first one is the vertical expansion that I mentioned before. So typically going in and saying, okay, we have a highly vulnerable group already supported by a government. During a crisis, they're even more impacted, and the support they get from the government is not enough to maintain their lives. So we temporarily increase the value or the duration of benefits for affected populations. Horizontal expansion is also very common, where we look at how can we temporarily increase the caseload. So if a government is supporting 2,000 people, with cash as part of the social protection program, how can humanitarian actors go in and add on to that? So maybe for a specific period of time, it's scaling to reach maybe 5,000 people. There's piggybacking. So the piggybacking means that we're looking at what is the social protection infrastructure that's already in place, but we're really doing something which is a parallel structure to social protection. So the funding to expand, for example, is not going in directly to the government and their work, but is something humanitarian actors are doing on the side. And this is probably the more common than putting funds directly into a government program. It also gives the advantage that we can do a bit of cherry picking. So we can take some elements that we think are the best, take them and copy them. But if there's some elements that we think humanitarian actors might be doing better, such as accountability, for example, we can still build that into the programming and really strengthen what's actually already in place. And then there's the refocusing and design tweaks. And this especially is in how we are working with the governments. Can we go in and actually impact how governments are also doing their social protection? So maybe that direct link between the social protection program led by the government and the safety nets activities implemented by humanitarian actors is strengthened, and that we see also the quality of government programs increase. So again, humanitarian actors are typically better at things like community engagement and accountability, and can really help strengthen those aspects. We might have different approaches to targeting that can also help revise in the way that governments are targeting, etc., etc. And then of course also the shock responsiveness, as I mentioned in the beginning. A few words on why we want to link to social protection. So of course we see increasing humanitarian crisis. We see that shocks are increasingly predictable and recurrent and often protracted. So again, linking very, very well into anticipatory action. We suffer on our side on short-term humanitarian funding cycles and programs, and linking to social protection might be able to give a little bit of sustainability there. And then if we link early action to the social protection systems, we'll also find cost effectiveness impacts. We'll see timeliness of the early action by using existing systems and really the speed of setting things up. And then I think all of us in the Red Crescent movement know this, but a focus on localization and better resource use is of course also a key reason for why we're linking with local government actors. And this is the last you'll hear from me. So just quickly, some of the preconditions that are necessary to be able to establish the linkages between social protection and cash and voucher assistance. We're looking at a social protection system that already is using cash and or voucher assistance in their non-contributory support to affected populations. We are looking at, of course, people themselves having a preference for being supported through cash. We are seeing political acceptance in a specific context of linking humanitarian program with social protection system. And then a strong intent especially from government actors to strengthen the existing systems that a state has in place, so that we can go in and do some of the design tweaks that makes a government social protection system and the humanitarian programs fit together. So as I said, this is just a very, very brief rundown on social protection. There are lots of resources available out there. You can also reach out if you want more. Peter in Kenya will say a bit more about how they are also working with social protection especially. And then I will pause it for now and hope that that at least gave you a little bit of an idea about why social protection and cash and voucher assistance and early action or anticipatory action activities fit together. Phoebe, over to you. please take us away on the next.
Thank you so much, Maya, for that very insightful discussion we just had about the social protection, quite relevant to anticipatory actions. And I will take over and briefly highlight on the various ways and means we can include cash into the anticipatory action. Again, just a reminder that we have requested for you to share your feedback on the assignment that we had requested for you to do. So maybe Maya, you can just share the link again for those who just joined so that you can continue to get more feedback. Good afternoon, colleagues. For those who are not able to join us in our first session, I hope you are able to listen to the recording, but either way, I just want to make a really brief introduction of anticipatory action. And really, when you defined anticipatory action in the previous session, we were looking at this as an approach or a means in which it provides a basis for stakeholders to utilize early warning information to trigger a set of planned and pre-financed measures that can be taken when a disaster is either imminent, it's either prior to the shock or before the acute impact of a particular shock are felt. And currently we are taking advantage of the advances in weather and climate forecasting, but also currently broadly, we are looking at anticipatory action for other things as health, for other things as conflict. So different technologies are being utilized to advance these particular decisions. Next, Maya. So for my next slide, I will just again briefly talk about the early action protocol. For again, those who are not in our meeting last week, and we said that this is a document that has been developed by a national society, and it can be done with support from a partner national society. It can be done with support from other stakeholders, depending on the context that you're operating with. And it basically outlines their proposed plan to address one hazard in their country. So how are they going to address the impacts of floods, or how are they going to ensure that they take early action prior to the impacts of the floods being experienced by the community. And for each early action protocol, we describe those proposed plans for that one particular hazard, but we see that a national society can have several EAPs. You can have an early action protocol on floods, you can have an early action protocol on droughts, you can have an action protocol on, for example, cyclones, you can have an early action protocol on conflict. Really, it depends on what are the vulnerabilities in the context that you're in, and what have you prioritized to support the community in terms of anticipating and preparing for this particular event. Again, we mentioned that in the early action protocol, maybe we can just go back, Maya, we have three main elements. We looked at the triggers, we looked at the selections of the actions, and here we are looking at actions around preparedness, the readiness, the early action, and then we have the budget, which as per now it's at 350, but I'm aware that this has been increased to 300 and it has been increased to 500,000 CHF. Next slide. So in terms of looking at cash in early action protocol, Maya has made very pertinent comments around the need for cash and social protection in the current context that is being impacted by climate change. And also looking at anticipatory cash transfers, this is proving again and again to be a very effective measure, especially during extreme weather events. And when we look at the extreme weather events sometimes happening in a manner that is very fast, so that probably if it's about transportation of food, probably it is not very possible. We look at these extreme weather events, sometimes cutting off people, and probably we are not able to reach them into other things that provide them other things that probably we have in our stores or in our silos. And so cash transfers have time and time again proved to be a very effective measure. One, we are looking at it supporting the food security of the vulnerable households, especially where things such as roads are cut off. Things, for example, such as roads that are used to transport, let's say, produce to the market and from the farms. They're looking at, for example, roads cut off so that the humanitarian workers are not able to reach these communities. And we see that really it supports especially the food security for the vulnerable household, because they're still able to access those foods that are still available in the market. It also supports in reducing the asset loss and damage, especially when we are looking at, for example, supporting the reinforcement of shelters. We are looking at things like, for example, evacuation before the full impact of that particular event happens, or before the actual event actually happens. So people are able to secure their property, they're able to move to places that are more safer, and hence their loss and damage relating from this impact is reduced. We also believe that anticipatory cash transfers are effective because they support enhancing the adoption of prepared measures. I think in the last meeting we talked about it supports the resilience building of communities, and communities are able to continue with their various preparatory activities prior to these events happening. And now for this session, we just want to look at how can we ensure that cash transfers are anticipatory in nature, or how can they support anticipatory action within the various communities that we work with. And of course, there are some suggestions that we can combine additional anticipatory measures when we're doing the cash transfers. And we looked at this in the subsequent slides, and some of the examples that we can give at this particular point. We're looking at the dissemination of early warning information from our national meteorological and hydrological services. We are looking at cash transfers supporting evacuation to support achievement of a stronger impact. But also we are looking at cash transfers being able to be integrated in a very timely fashion to support in the recovery of the people after the event. So we're looking at cash as being very important, as Maja explained last week, in terms of preparedness, anticipatory action, but also in the response component. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, we have three critical elements of the early action protocol. We talked about the triggers, we talked about the action, where we were looking at prepositioning, early actions, and the readiness, and then we have the budget part. And according to me, I think one of the areas that we can clearly include cash in our early action protocol is in these selections of action. That is prepositioning, the readiness, as well as the early action. I know we talked last week around the process of the focus-based financing, and we had the risk assessment, where as we are conducting this assessment, we can look at the capacities of communities to be able to utilize the different modalities related to cash, as was explained by Maja. We're looking at how is the market like? Is it a strong market? Is it a robust market? What technologies or what gadgets do the communities have that can support this cash process? For example, in the Kenyan setting, and I'm sure we'll hear from Kenya Red Cross, we have the mobile technology that's supporting cash transfers. What else is available aside from that? And maybe as I'm talking about these activities, last time we were not able to get a chance to go in depth, but today I think we can look at, when you talk about prepositioning activities, what are we talking about, and how can we bring the cash component into this selection of activities? So looking at prepositioning activities, we are looking at the procurement activities that will be done once at the beginning of the project, and that is usually after the early action protocol has been approved. And these activities, procurement activities, are required to support or to ensure the relief items are readily available to implement the early action once the trigger is reached. And sometimes you will have to procure things that have a longer shelf life, which is good. Some of the things they cannot be procured because they have a shorter shelf life. For example, you can't buy medicine in advance. You cannot buy, like, let's say, foodstuff early in advance, but you can be able to come up with agreements with these service providers so that immediately the early action protocol is triggered, then these service providers are able to produce these items that have short life almost immediately, but in good condition. Maybe Maja, they can still go back. And when you're looking at examples of some of the activities under prepositioning, of course, as I mentioned before, we can combine some of the cash transfer activities with early anticipatory action. So we have materials with early warning messaging, we have evacuation, we have, maybe you can get sandbags or jerrycans. But looking at the cash component, here it's important that when you're doing the prepositioning, you can use this opportunity to map and identify the different cash service providers. For example, if it's the telecom companies, if it's the people who sell the cash vouchers, if let's say the bank, you need to get into an agreement with the bank, at this stage you're able to do this kind of stuff. Maybe if it's the procurement of vouchers, you can also do that as part of the anticipatory activities, including the signing of contracts, among other things that I believe my colleagues from Kenya and Bangladesh are going to speak about. Next, when you look at the readiness activities, we are looking at activities that will facilitate the smooth implementation of early actions. And these ones are usually essential for the trigger-based activation of the early action protocol. And these are activities are taken on a continuous basis. So it can range from training of, the branch managers, training of the volunteers, community mapping, looking at, simulation activities, capacity assessments, including the cash readiness of the national society, establishing of contracts with providers, conducting market assessments, including other things as, for example, ensuring that you have the right HR to support the implementation of this. And also looking at the cash component of this, as I mentioned, of course, having a capacity assessment, including cash capacity assessment of the national society. Do you have a cash voucher assistant person within your national society to support with this as part of the anticipatory process? What else do you need to do as readiness activities that will support the easier triggering of this early action protocol? So we can have various readiness activities related to cash that we can do on a daily basis during the period of the early action protocol to ensure that our national societies are cash ready and they're able to do anticipatory action through cash. Finally, we have the early actions. And when we look at the early action activities, of course, these are the trigger-based activities which will reduce the impact of an extreme event. So once the trigger has been reached, what activities can we do that would reduce the impact of the extreme event? And different contexts will do different things. For example, if it's related to floods, it will be different. If it's related to drought, it will be different. Maybe cyclone, it will be different. But some of the things that can be done and have a touch of cash, we can have providing, once the trigger has been reached, we provide people with the cash and vouchers that we were able to procure during the prepositioning stages, the different trainings that we're able to take our volunteers in terms of disbursement of these vouchers and cash, so that communities are able to buy food, they're able to buy medicine, they're able to buy fodder for their livestock, they're able to get hygiene kits and different things that would, at the end of the day, maintain or retain their dignity. Also, we can look at cash supporting, especially, as I mentioned before, the reinforcing of temporary shelter. So we can get people, train them in the shelter components, for example, PASA, that they can support communities to reinforce, their shelters. And at the end of the day, we pay them cash, either to support them with the evacuation or to support them with getting, food and other items for their family members. Also, cash can be very essential as an early action to support in moving livestock to safety or relocating market stalls and other assets for the different communities. And then also finally, we're looking at cash supporting early harvesting of crops or fish ponds in the event that, let's say, we're going to get severe flooding or we are going to get severe drought in an area. I know different people have different thoughts about early harvesting. It would be good to hear your thoughts and comments on this in the comment section in terms of having early harvesting of crops and fish ponds as part of an early action activity. Then the last two slides from my end, just to depict a timeline of activities. This is an example, it's not reality, but this is an example. In the case, for example, of drought that takes, it's a slow onset event, and you can be able to embark on early action in different ways. We can have, for example, in the case of drought where we have 60 days, 14 days, 10 days, and then we can also look at the ones for floods where we have maybe shorter time limits on this. Maja, you want to take us through this, or can I start and then we will complement? Okay, so I will give the example of maybe the case of drought where we 60 days after we have the first trigger. Let's say we have the different first approaches. 60 days on, let's say the National Met has released a forecast, and they're saying we are having the third consecutive rainfall season that has failed. We can do things like updated assessment, and the updated assessments can range from, you know, assessments of different things. How is the community capacity like? What are their current vulnerabilities? What are the impacts as a result of these drought and all those kind of stuff? We can go ahead and do a pre-crisis market assessment during that period, revise the transfer value of the different modalities that we are using. We can also use this time to pre-register and verify at-risk households based on the updated assessment, the pre-crisis markets, and also the revised transfer values. And then also we can utilize this time to set up any complaint and feedback mechanism. This is quite important. I know all of us are aware about the community engagement accountability. We need to ensure that at the end of the day, our communities are satisfied. You know, in case of any complaint, we're able to give them feedback. In case of any sexual harassment, abuse, or whatever kind, at least that mechanism has been set up. 14 days, let's say we have a very soft trigger in terms of either the what do you call them? The IPC reports, or let's say another forecast update has been given by the National Met. So here from the National Society level, we can do refresher training for our volunteers and our branch staffs. We can do another re-verification of the pre-registered households at the community level, at the branch level, continue market monitoring. Remember, we had done a pre-crisis market assessment, so we will continue to do market monitoring. Then you can have the CFM activated if this has not been done, and then we can be able to alert the FSP to ensure that everything is set and ready to go. 10 days where we see that things are not you know, they're not improving, or there's a likely chance of deterioration. We can do the cash voucher assistant prepositioning. We can have the PO prepare for the FSP and the funds that are sent, depending on the modality that we have agreed, if it's via mobile or, you know, people collecting their vouchers and all those kind of things, so that they're able to start supporting their community, their families, either through the purchase of fodder or the purchase of food or whatever option they would have done. So that's a slightly longer time frame. We can have a shorter time frame where like we just have days and immediately we have the hard trigger that has been met. And next,
or also as a continuation of the previous, I would say.
Yeah.
This as well. Yeah.
Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So these are some of the activities that you can actually do when you meet now the hard trigger. And the hard trigger can be now, let's say, especially during this time, you'll find most of the government releasing either emergency, what do they always call them? You know, state of emergency statements. You know, for example, if it's in the case of the National Society, they're like, we have reached the maximum of our trigger, let's do this and all that. And so here we can start the cash for work activities if it has been included. We can send the beneficiary list to the FSP. We can now start the FSP planning, continue monitoring of the market. And then the next 5 days, we can do the cash disbursement to the registered households, reconciliation of any form that needs to be done. And of course, the monitoring will continue real time. And this can be both for floods, cyclone, drought, conflict, whichever option that we'll choose to pick on. It's also important that we continue with the information dissemination to our communities, to our branches, and to all the relevant stakeholders, because then we don't want to have any kind of panic whatsoever. Consider providing technical support or getting technical support, especially if it's related to anticipatory action and cash, from the cash technical support, and then anticipatory action technical support. And then, of course, as you mentioned earlier, it's important that we continue to involve our CEA colleagues as well as the PGI colleagues, that's community engagement accountability, as well as protection, gender inclusion throughout this particular process. I think I'll stop at that, Maya. I don't know if you have any compliments, but I'll stop at that. Over.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. So these two last slides with the timeline really was just an example of how to start thinking about when you're also building up your early action protocols. What are the different steps that are needed for cash to actually be in there, and try and detail them as much as possible. Because if you've forgotten that you also need to prepare the FSP in advance and you just put in your early action protocol that you will do cash without doing that, of course, you'll be in trouble by the time you are actually ready to distribute cash to people. It's just a little drop down in that. So all of these activities are important to have in your early action protocols, but whether they are at the same exact timeline that we put in here, of course, might differ. The triggers are also related to whether you will have funding available or not. So some activities might need to be something that you are thinking of in your general cash preparedness, where you will then have that as a separate project. Some activities might fit into your readiness activities, so things that are funded in the early action protocols, and then some of the activities as the early actions you're actually implemented are funded when you reach the hard trigger. So this is all things to consider in the design of your early action protocols. But thanks so much, Phoebe. This was very valuable, and I hope that you're all taking note of the overall key principles still for the early action protocols. We will go to Kenya. So Peter Morgård from Kenya Red Cross is with us. I hope, Peter, that you are still around and you will unmute yourself and take us through this. I think it's a really interesting case study coming from your side.
Thank you very much, Maja. Thank you, Phoebe. Very interesting insights. It's always a learning opportunity for us, even as you continue. You never learn enough. So I think with the background that has already been shared very well by Maja and Phoebe, it would just be good for me to just delve into just sharing what we learned in Kenya Red Cross. In the month of March this year, we sought to simulate a flood early actions protocol that had everything that Phoebe has summarized embedded therein. And in the interest of time, because we just want to not repeat or do an overkill on things shared, but just to utilize the time well, I'll just go straight into the lessons learned. And maybe if you could go to slide number 4, where I can just talk about the KRCS flood early actions. Of course, there was that question of whether it is feasible to use cash, and Phoebe has done a good job trying to explain to us which ways we could do. So for the Kenya context, the floods prioritized impacts were deaths and people injured, disruption or inaccessible of critical services and infrastructure, healthcare facilities, schools, roads, and electricity, destruction or damage to houses leading to displacement of people, and outbreak of waterborne diseases affecting people. And lastly, number 5 was outbreak of waterborne diseases affecting livestock. For purposes of the scope of the simulation exercise and after consultation, we opted to simulate impact number 1 and number 3, basically death and people injured, and destruction or damage to houses leading to displacement of people. If you look at that, you can see the early actions under this were dissemination of early warning messages, support to physical evacuation, placement of flood markers as some of the early actions. And when you go to the number 3 was supporting physical evacuation, prepositioning of shelter and wash NFIs, and then distribution of shelter and wash NFIs. In our context, and for relevance for us to simulate the cash for early action, and I know there are many lessons that could be drawn, but for the purposes of this discussion, I will keep myself to the cash aspect. So for purposes of cash for early action, we felt that we could use cash to support physical evacuation, placement of flood markers, and some bit of just the wash NFI items. And how did we go about doing this? Some of the things we realized as we were looking at the issues of cash for early action is that when cash is provided early to recipients of aid, it can enable them to save their livelihood assets, valuable assets rather, because then they have a means of being able to act early. They have a means of redeeming themselves and even probably moving their items to other places. But some things that come into contexts that can be a challenge from the normal other ways of operating for cash is that cash for early action, when you think about it, you have some things to think about. First of all, the untimeliness, because much even as you're using credible focus and predictions and all those kind of things, when the trigger comes, you always anticipate, yes, but it could come suddenly where you need to act. And I like the fact that when we were seeing the last two slides from Phoebe about the timelines, there was a 60 days, and then there was that which you're saying had hit 5 days. What if you have to act within 5 days? So there was that issue of timeliness. The issue of short time frame to conduct registrations and maybe to identify people, to verify them so that you are able to just make sure that these people are doing the right things. And so this, what we learned was we need to get to a point where we are preparing early. So therefore, we felt to say that we shall be preparing early. That we can take some readiness activities that are quite critical. And what are these readiness activities that need to be taken in good time that are quite critical? You could see that even from Phoebe's presentation, there are some actions that need to take place early, like pre-contracting of financial service providers, the flexibility of targeting and swift registration, and issues around access to functioning markets, and then the transfer values. If these things are not addressed in good time, and you need to swing during an early action, it poses a very big challenge. So in our context, what we did is we undertook some activities around what we thought that could be good for preparation. If maybe we could move to the next slide, that we linked with the Social Protection Secretariat. And why were we working around linkages with the Social Protection Secretariat was because maybe Phoebe, if you could click all the buttons so that it just comes fully. I know I'd plan to talk through one by one, but time will not allow to go one by one. Thank you. So the National Social Protection Secretariat, we took time to engage them in good time so that at the cash working group level, we have a harmonized social protection monitoring tool that was being developed. There is the National Enhanced Single Registry. And why the National Enhanced Single Registry? Because this database will have vulnerable populations in details that are stored in advance, so that when it comes to the time of needing to act early, we don't have to start from scratch to do fresh registration, but we are just harvesting from this tool. And I know every person will want to ask, how can we verify the data that has gone in? Those are some of the activities we do around readiness, those periods that Phoebe was talking about, that you have all the time to critique, to analyze, to see how this data was collected, to even do it together with the Social Protection Secretariat. For the Kenya context, we've chosen to do that together with the Social Protection Secretariat, and also allow partners to use the harmonized targeting tool to feed it into the Social Protection Registry. I think, and you can see down there, there's the harmonization of beneficiary registration tool. So there was the element of reviewing the social protection policy, and the whole idea of reviewing the social protection policy and to link it with the shock responsive social protection was to enable us, or to empower us as actors, to be able to query or review that tool, which is a government-led tool. You all know, dealing with government, if you do not have a mechanism that allows you to query or interrogate the platform, then it can be inhibiting. And if we just progress to the next slide. So after we were doing this, the readiness activities that we did in order to just prepare ourselves, we undertook pre-crisis market mapping to understand functionality of markets, and this entailed capacity building of the teams to understand pre-crisis market monitoring, and then also mapping out the markets that were critical. Then, of course, the pre-crisis mapping to understand them, the FSP mapping and pre-agreements with the relevant financial service providers, beneficiary management systems and registration tools. And this was to do with the Social Protection Secretariat, Kenya Red Cross, the Red Cross platform, linking it to the Social Protection Secretariat, so that at least they can speak into each other. And you can see they were following each other so that they're interlinked. And when we need to use them, we can use them. There were the issues around making sure that we've repositioned cash. We've worked around the M-Pesa platform to make sure that we are looking at M-Pesa platform and we are seeing that there is money in it, so that we're not saying that this will be there. SOPs, manuals, guidelines. For example, the finance manual. For us to preposition cash, the finance manual has to speak into that. For us to preposition service providers, we have to make sure that the procurement policy allows them to preposition or pre-qualify such people. So all these were enablers that came in. And then we were looking at stakeholder engagement to make sure that all stakeholders at all levels have been engaged. They're aware about these things. If it is the county government, the national government, the sub-county level, the community members understand that these activities are going to happen, the community disaster management committees. So these are some of the readiness activities we did. And then moving on, as we were approaching
Just to say, I'm just saying for people, there's a few abbreviations here. I'm putting them in the chat in case you're not getting all of them.
All right, so sorry, thank you. Thank you very much, Maja. Yeah, so what we actually, how we did all this was, we now set out to do a pre-crisis market mapping, just about 3 weeks to the exercise, to make sure that we understood that the markets were functioning well and that everything was available. And then there were technical capacities. We made sure in the particular regions, there were people who are ready there to undertake these activities and to implement them. Now comes to the 7 days to the events. I know we now realize that looking at the 7-day window, we just quickly mobilized the communities for, in this time it was verification, then re-registering those who were missing out, because already we had tried to link that with the social protection system, and then we were trying to look at our beneficiary mapping. So the targeting, the registration and verification, we did that. And then after we had verified them and they were in our register, we commenced the work on cash for work. So the modality on cash for early action in this case we chose was cash for work, because this was going to enable us to rehabilitate the infrastructure, the critical infrastructure with relation to floods. The people prioritized clearing waterways, they prioritized rehabilitation of the dikes, and then clearing critical bushes, or areas that were covered by bush, so that at least it can clear the waterways, because they felt this is what was limiting them so much. Now, 3 days to the event, upon approaching the trigger, we disbursed cash via M-Pesa to beneficiaries. Remember earlier on, we had said we had prepositioned cash in the M-Pesa platform. While we were prepositioning, something that is critical, the internal memos were going on, the communication to have money transferred, verification of the data, and then sharing the manifest with the finance team, finance team to be able to know that cash should be disbursed at this person when we alert you. So when we were ready to alert them upon the trigger, cash was disbursed to 416 beneficiaries. I must mention though, that about 10 of them who were wrong, their names, this happens always when you're disbursing, their names were withheld back, and we had to re-verify, then share this back. So if we may go to the next slide, Maja. So some of the lessons we learned, and you can see the wonderful pictures there, it's some of the work that was going on in the community. The first picture up there, you can see the communities doing cash for work, preparing the flood markers, and then below there, part of the clearing waterways. There are many wonderful pictures. We could not be able to share all of them. Then also, of course, to relocation, but the lessons learned was that cash for work made it possible for communities to provide manpower and prioritize critical infrastructures that needed rehabilitation. Sometimes we make decisions for them, but giving them the cash for work and then discussing with them what work should be done, what was critical, what was priority, that is something that gave us a big plus. Then the cash received by the communities enabled them to meet their personal needs, besides the ability to pay for transportation of their valuable assets. This is feedback that we got, that oftentimes the challenges they have when flooding comes is they're not able to hire the boats that are ferrying commodities. Only the rich people are able to move things. So sometimes by the time they're getting help, they have lost their valuable assets. And then pre-registration of beneficiaries is vital in supporting timely humanitarian assistance, and especially in this case to do with early actions. And then there is need to embark on targeting and registration process with assurance of availability of resources to cover the intended cash transfers. If we do a pre-registration, for example, which is ideal for cash for early action, and there is no resources that can cover these people, you can imagine what happens when the event is likely to occur and we've reached the triggers, but then we do not have the resources to be able to support them. And then there is need to allocate sufficient resources for community engagement and accountability activities, and subsequently implement the same as expected so as to manage community expectations. I know Phoebe underscored the issues of dissemination of early warning messages, communicating critical things. So sometimes this can be easily underrated, but one thing we learned is there is need to allocate resources for that as well, because even as we communicated about what the cash was going to do, the intentions of the objectives, I mean of the simulation and everything, there was still that need of community engagement. So there's need to allocate sufficient resources. The keyword there is sufficient. If we might move to what are the next steps that we are looking into doing as we move forward, we want to really plow heavy on the shock responsive pillar in the social protection, and then so that we can now make sure the social safety net systems are really speaking to us. Maja made a wonderful presentation of how we can link with social protection. Phoebe underscored it a bit. They would really help timely action for us. If we may go to the next step, Maja. Yeah, so we need to preposition resources for crisis modifiers. We need to have advocacy for resource mobilization for cash for early action so that people are able to do their stuff. And then mapping and utilization of most effective community channels across all target locations to be applied as part of community engagement and accountability. If we might just conclude, is that something we learned when we were doing this exercise is cash is such an enabler when we're talking about anticipatory work. After the scientists and the climate team has done their work of giving us such credible work, cash for early action really pushes it to the next level. Thank you, and back to you, Maja.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was really excellent and very, very interesting. You've also captured your audience, so there's already quite a few questions in the chat. Feel free to take a few of them in the chat or start looking at them, and we'll take them up in the Q&A. There's also a clapping hand from Phoebe, so we're all very happy. This was great, and we hope you stick around for the Q&A as well. Khairul, that means you are up, and we are taking a trip to Bangladesh. Are you with us and ready?
Yeah, thank you so much, Maja, and thanks to Phoebe and Peter also for the wonderful presentation. I think now my job is so easy. I can really link our experience, what you were talking actually. Next slide, please. Okay, this is what we are doing and why we are doing. So we are working in 3 hazards. One is cyclone, flood, and heat wave. We recently started heat wave in 2020. So these are the early actions. I tried to capture all of them together, like early warning, awareness generation, evacuation, first aid support, food and water support in the shelter, safe shelter, and of course now COVID-19 measures, as well as gas, on which I'll be talking today. Next slide, please. Okay, so to implement CAS or to include CAS in the early action or in the early action protocol, these are the couple of actions that we did beforehand to consider CAS. So definitely to identify CAS as one of the early action, we need to definitely check on ground the community, whether that is what they need actually on the ground, whether CAS is needed or not. Community consultations have been a couple of key informant interviews we conducted. We talked with the key stakeholders on ground and check whether cash is really feasible as well as whether cash is needed. Definitely, as we do for the general cash intervention, we definitely did the market survey, market analysis. One thing, particularly for the cash in early action or anticipatory action, I think that is what the previous presenters were also trying to talk, particularly Phoebe, the lead time that we have versus whether cash is feasible or not. For example, I was mentioning that we are talking in 3 hazards: cyclone, flood, heat wave. Cash is feasible for 2 hazards, for flood and heat wave, but it's not really feasible for cyclone. Why? Because we have only 30+ hours of lead time. So imagine, I mean, within that 30 hours, which is 1.5 days maybe, within that time, we need to implement or transfer the cash. We do all the preparation and then transfer the cash. And there should be, it's not only transferring the cash to the beneficiary, but the beneficiary should have time to use that cash before the cyclone hit the community, but there is no time. So that's why initially we piloted cash in the cyclone EAP, but later on we dropped that because we found in our evaluation, we found that the beneficiary, they were not able to use the cash before the cyclone. They used it after the cyclone, but we actually adapted that, and we are doing now more of in-kind support for the cyclone. And at the readiness components, particularly at the National Society, we have the cash SOP, we have strategy, we have agreement with the financial service providers, particularly with the Bangladesh Post Office, which is one of the government service, and they are so kind to us that they go down to the community to transfer the cash. They're officials, they go down actually. But later on, I think I'll also talk during the COVID-19, we are also working with the mobile money transfer FSBs, because last year, while we were implementing the cash for the heat wave, there was COVID-19 restrictions and physical gathering was not allowed. So we were using the MMTs also. We have trained staffs and volunteers who are supporting for all these implementations. And for some of the areas, we have decentralized and localized fund. So once the early action protocol is triggered, with that fund, we can start the implementation of the intervention or even the cash intervention before the fund from DREV reaches to the host National Society, and then it goes down to the branches. So we have that that opportunity also. Apart from that, I think the coordination with the local government, which is very crucial, so that we get adequate support from them, as well as they are not really becoming one of the many hinder to implement the cash. Sometimes that happens actually. We have partnership with the Flood Forecasting Warning Center, as well as the Bangladesh Meteorological Department, so that they are also providing us, and we have the access to the early warning very quickly, and sometimes early also, before they publish it on their website. So we have that feasibility. And then we have partnership with World Food Program, and under that partnership, we are able to cover more number of beneficiaries. It was 4,000 and now it's 6,000. So 6,000 households we can cover additionally to what we are covering under the DREV funding. We are also, I mean, Peter was also mentioning about the cash working group, so we are also coordinating with them. And very recently, we have started talking whether we should actually define a cash package for early action, because the cash package that we are using, it's for general program, it's for the response. So yeah, we are trying to talk to them and maybe define, maybe very recently we'll be able to get a cash package for anticipatory action also. Next slide, please. This is what we did very recently. I'm not talking about all the history, but these are the very recent 2 cash interventions that we did. In 2020, the flood early action that was activated, and we were able to reach out to 3,800 households, and each of them received 4,500 Bangladeshi taka, which is around 50 USD. And last year in 2020, for the heat wave early action, we were able to reach out to 197 households. Next slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to also talk on what were the challenges and what were the measures that we took while we were implementing the cash component during COVID-19, particularly last year for the heat wave. So it was supposed to be through Bangladesh Post Office, and for Bangladesh Post Office, it was supposed to be physical cash. As I mentioned, that the officials, they go down to the community and they hand over the cash to the beneficiary, to the recipients. But it was not possible. One, that would actually might aggravate the situation with COVID-19, and yeah, it might actually spread the virus. So we should not allow that. As well as there was very strict restrictions from the government that we can't really conduct any kind of physical gathering or physical activity in the community. So that's why what we did, we worked with the mobile money transfer, which is bKash here, and we transfer the money through them. And in the community, there are agents, and through them, the recipients, they went there, and with their mobile number and the messages, they can actually withdraw the money from them. So that's how we did. This was definitely one of the challenges, but I would say also the positive side was this was one of the great learnings that we had, that we have another alternate options that we can deploy if needed. Next slide, please. Okay, these are, there are lots of findings, which is actually supporting that, yes, cash in early action, it's really hugely beneficial to the recipients. But these are the few I took out from our recent evaluation, which was against the 2020 flood early actions. So the first one I would like to talk is that the cash recipients, they were actually able to mitigate the damages and losses that could be related to their household assets that could be related to the livelihood assets. For example, the livestock or maybe chicken. They were able to protect them. They were able to take care of them and also evacuate them to safe shelter. The other areas, I think, one of the key areas I think we got from the evaluation that we did was that the beneficiary, they were able to cope better with the situation, and hence they have to render to the negative coping strategy that happens basically just after the events, the disaster. So we have two groups, one, the recipients, another one who didn't have any support from the early action or early action protocol. So we were able to compare who were actually in better position to take care and deal with the situation from the flood. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the last slide. I tried to keep it short so that we can have some time for the question answer. Definitely, we had lots of challenges, but these are the four key ones I wanted to talk. We were really talking about the lead times, which is always, I think, for anticipatory action, it's really short. For flood, we get only 5 days, but in reality, it's not really 5 days. It's 3 days or 4 days max we get. So now we are using two forecasts. One is the global one, which is the ECM, GloFirst, and that gives us 15 days. Earlier it was 10 days, but since last year we have 15 days of lead time, which we use for what Phoebe was saying, like the soft trigger, or we call it the pre-activation trigger. And then we get from the Bangladesh Meteorological Department 5 days forecast, which we use actually for the activation trigger, or in Phoebe's language, which is the hard trigger. So while we get the 15 days of lead time, what we do for cash, I'm talking about the cash, we train our volunteer very quickly for data collection, and then we send them to the community. They go to house to house and collect the data through Kobo. And before that 5 days lead time, we are ready with the final beneficiary leads. list, and all the checking, all the verification, those are done before the 5 days. Once the activation trigger happens, which is basically 5 days max, or maybe 4 days, we go down to the community and start the cash transfer. And by the time, the other early actions also start, which is like the evacuation, first aid, as well as support at the shelter. So what I wanted to say is this lead time is always really short. So that is one of the challenges, to transfer the cash, to select the beneficiary, and as well as implement other early actions. Accuracy of the forecast is another challenge, which might be actually hindering your cash intervention or any other early action. If that is not really accurate, reliable, as well as it's not giving you the lead time that you need, which is 5 days for us, if it gives 2 days, it's very challenging. So it happens actually. That's I think one of the practical challenges that we face. Then COVID-19 definitely poses us additional layer of challenges to implement cash as well as other early actions. The way forward is, as I mentioned, that we are trying to expand the FSPs, Bangladesh Post Office, MMT. We are trying to have a number of MMTs so that we can have options. One is not working, we can reach out to another one and have MOU, have agreement with them so that we can agree with what will be the process to implement the early action. But I'm saying that because the Bangladesh Post Office, they actually need the money before they go to the community to transfer or to hand over the cash to the beneficiary. But now we agreed with them that once we are able to submit that, deposit that check to their account, and if we can show the photocopy of that check that it's actually deposited, they can go down. They don't really wait for the encashment of the cash. They go down to the community and start transferring the cash. And of course, the 15 days lead time we are using now, it's giving us a little bit privilege that we have 5 days more lead time now. Earlier it was 10 days. And it is really helpful to select the beneficiary and verify the list, as well as take other readiness action before the 5 days activation trigger. That's all from my end, and thank you so much for listening. I look forward to answer any of the questions that you might have. Over, Maja.
Amazing, Carol. Thank you so much for sharing that, and very good explanation of how you've been able to change the lead times and what you're looking at as a way forward there. I really enjoyed that part, and also the highlight that of course the cash needs to be in people's hands early enough also for them to spend it before the shock. I think that's maybe something we haven't emphasized enough, so thank you also for bringing that point. This gives us pretty good time for the Q&A, and I'm very happy with that. I think Phoebe has been organizing questions a bit, so we will be asking some to both Carol and Peter, and anything, Phoebe, if you want to answer any of them as well. So over to you to take us away on some of the questions that we've seen.
Great, thank you so much, Maja, Carol, and Peter. Quite a lot of engagement going on in the chat box. Maybe they can just give a few comments that have come through, and then I will create the room for questions. And I see already a hand is up that wants to ask a question. So just a comment, some of the comments that came through from the participants. We have one comment from Yusufu Kamara, who says that signing pre-disaster agreement with vendors after due diligence and partners. I think just as a comment in terms of feedback to Cairo, then there was also another comment by Yusufu again, assessing multiple financial service providers, an important part of the EAP. So I think also in relation to the due diligence or relation to the EAP. Then we also had a comment from you, Maja, which I think was a valid point. It's important that cash needs to be in the hands early enough for people also to have time to spend it as they need before the shock. A very good point. And then also Aston from Malawi Red Cross making a point that pre-registration is really key and needs to be timely. Maybe we can take 3 batches of questions. I'll start with the ones that have already been asked, and quite a number have been addressed to Peter. And then I will take two from the chat box, and then we can give the RR Ops Kenya to also ask a question since his hand is up. So Peter, we have quite a number of questions for you. So I'll start with a question from Abelaina, who asks on which criteria the pre-registration of beneficiaries is based. And then also another question from Anita to you, Peter, that is anticipatory action included in your multi-hazard contingency plans? And is there a plan in place for what happens if the threshold is not quite reached? So we take the third question from, the hand went down. So maybe if I can ask the third question to you, Peter, then you can respond in batches of 3. We have on the lessons learned, again from Anita, regarding having resources, is that now not a risk because you have an EAP in place with IFRC to access FBA by the draft? So Peter, you want to start with those 3 questions, and then we will keep getting more questions.
Thank you. Thank you all. And Khairul, also very insightful lessons also from Bangladesh. I think I was actually flipping through the questions and I was looking at them, and just to answer the ones you asked me, starting with the first one you asked about the criteria of pre-registering beneficiaries. So I know we are all used to issues around having a certain criteria that just looks at vulnerabilities. Yes, that still applies. But now when you look at the floods EAP, for example, you look at the exposure to risk and the people who are exposed to the risk at most. Those are prioritized and then registered as would be beneficiaries in the event, in the case the event occurs. For example, in the areas that have been marked for the EAP, these are all areas that are in proximity to the they were in proximity to the flood, let's say like the backflows from the lake or overflows from the basins. Let's say, for instance, like the Nzoia River basins, the Athi River basins, the Tana River basins. So people who are living at that belt that is at exposure, those ones were prioritized so that they can be moved to higher ground. When it comes to drought, of course, there are also those indicators that mark them for vulnerability. So there are vulnerability indicators depending on the early action that we are seeking to, depending on the hazard that we're looking at. Drought had its own kind of vulnerability, flood at its own. I think that, I hope that answers that adequately. Otherwise, we'll need to break it down a bit much further. And this is something that we can share a document around that if we would like to see that. The second question was around if the if the EAP is linked into the multi-agency, multi-hazard contingency plan. Yes, in fact, that was one of the first assignments to say that as we do anticipatory work, it has to be linked in our contingency plans. We've done a lot of homework around this. We've engaged our colleagues, and it is embedded in the contingency plan. It has been linked to it. There was that question of, in the event that this event does not occur, the EAP made us think through this when they put us through the usefulness actions. There are some which are useful actions to around usefulness, and also looking at when you're thinking about the usefulness actions, that if this event does not occur, some of these activities that you've undertaken as early actions will still benefit those affected communities. But also a number of you will understand about the stop mechanism that allows us to stop when we need to stop acting out. That's why you see everything is set ready, but if the trigger is reached, then we act. If the trigger is not reached, then we apply the stop mechanism. I think I've answered the 3 questions that you asked. Have I left any out?
I think there's a question from Anita on lessons learned regarding having resources. Is that not a risk because you have an EAP in place with IFRC to access the FBA by the draft?
I think I didn't understand this question well. I must be honest. A risk in what way? Maybe I needed to understand it better.
Okay, maybe we can come back to Anita at a later point. We have 2 more questions from you. And Khairul, please feel free to complement Peter's response. We have a question from Anita again. How did Red Rose data management software link to the National Social Registry? And then another question from Gregoria, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. If you received beneficiaries list from the National Registry, did you carry out a Kobo survey door to door to check if they were the most vulnerable, or did you trust the list? So both questions linked to the National Social Registry. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. So Anita, a very good question about the Red Rose app. And we must be very honest, it is a process that we are still working on, linking the Red Rose app. What we did is that we now embarked on using what we are calling the harmonized targeting tool, which is co-developed with the Social Protection Secretariat, such that this tool, that if we take it up within Kenya Red Cross, and it's the same tool that is being used with the Social Protection Secretariat, the data will speak to each other. So the way we had to do it manually in this case, we really had to receive data manually, analyze it manually, then feed it into the Red Rose platform. That's how we did it now. But we are having plans in place, even intending to engage Red Rose further to see what it would take to ensure that there's integration. The reason why even that work is not complete yet is because we're also still engaging with the Social Protection Secretariat on their platform. There is what they're calling the complementarity platform. Sorry, I think I lost the second question. I'm trying to remember. Oh yeah, the issue of just trusting the list.
Yes.
Of course,
yeah.
we can't just trust the list, to be honest. And that's why, if you remember in my presentation, I talked about entering into MOUs and agreements with the government that allows us to vet and to verify the list that were being given to us. So what we were doing on the ground, to answer that question straight up, is when we got the list, we did what we call the community, and this will answer another question again that has been asked about migrants, migrating populations, is that when we get that list, we do what we, most of you will know, the community-based targeting, which is still the best way to go in Kenya at the moment, where you want to make sure that the community members, first of all, know these people, agree with the vulnerability ratings, and also that it is verifiable that this person is still here, lives here, and needs to be assisted. So we do that verification at the community level to make sure that these people are still, first of all, existing, and secondly, that yes, they need to be supported. Then now is when that is the verification process, then now we can add them to our list. And that also factors in other people. Something I must mention, we don't just rely on we are looking at working on what we're calling the social registry, which will have the entire population. We are not yet there. So that means when we get the government list, we will also ask at the community level who is not in this list that probably needs to be assisted.
Thank you so much, Peter. Yusufu, kindly mute your microphone if you're not speaking. I see we have a hand up, so I'll just alternate to the hands that are up, and then we'll go back to our question. Jones, I saw your hand is up. Can you, and then we will go to my call. So Jones, are you still there? Please make your intervention.
Yes, thank you so much, Phoebe, Maja, Peter, and Kairu for your very nice presentation. Mine was just to consider to link the, cash and anticipatory action, but also looking onto the importance and the beauty of also integrating EVCA in this in the cash and the anticipatory action, because now if the national state will invest more into EVCA intervention, they'll be able to understand the vulnerability, they'll be able to understand the hazard, the exposure, and the risk. And now the community themselves can develop community actions, identify, which are capacities that, they need to be supported for them to be able to prepare for effective response. But also, and now through now community action now, cash can come in and support now. They already identified community activity. Could be early warning, integration of traditional early warning and the major early warning systems. Could be also identification of safer routes. Could also be setting or rather identifying the safest areas or evacuation routes areas, I mean. So for me, I think it's very important also, Phoebe, to consider EVCA at the foundation for determining the community action interventions, which you actually build onto anticipatory actions. You see, and now cash will support, we also contribute into it. But also, looking at it, I'm looking at it on two levels, like, as a support to preparedness for effective response for the national society, but also the community themselves. So that is what I wanted to contribute. Thanks, and over from my end. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John. So I think that's a very important point, and it means very well when you look also in the bigger picture of disaster preparedness. So that's a very, very valid point. Michael, please go ahead. Please unmute and speak.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to just quickly complement the response from Peter, especially around working with the governments on the social registry. So what we learned from especially the case of Pakistan, where the National Society has initially established a data sharing protocol with the government, is that while it is definitely very beneficial to establish that as part of your preparedness in defining your early action protocols, but what is also for us needs to analyze is how many of that resources will be required for us to validate the list from the government, because at some point the list that you will receive will still require significant time from us to really go and validate that list. Maybe at some point we may need to establish easily, maybe the easier way is to work directly with the communities and identify our list easily, because so I think that those kinds of analysis needs to be also considered. But definitely data sharing protocol is as equally important as establishing your financial service provider, and the same as with your pre-crisis market mapping analysis. So I think there are also a few case studies also in the anticipation hub. Especially, I think what is good is from the recent experience in the Philippines on establishing data sharing protocols with the government, because there's still lots of learning around how do we engage our communities into having that final list with that of the list of the government. So yeah, something to consider. And then the CAA will have a big picture in those finalization of list of beneficiaries. Over.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. And if you have the link to that article, it would be good if you can share in the chat boxes as well. Sure. I see, Maja, please keep me on time. I see we have Cairo hand up, and then we will go and respond to 2 final questions, and then I will hand over back to you, Maja. Please go ahead, Cairo.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on the beneficiary registration, pre-registration, as well as registration during or just before the implementation of early action. So I think with both the approaches, there are, I think, positive sides as well as negative sides. Yusufu, you have mentioned that RAST registration might be we might actually left out some of the people who actually need support. That might happen. But as well as with the pre-registration, there are challenges. I'm talking about from our examples here. So if we pre-register and if we transfer the cash through mobile money transfer, MMT, that actually needs the wallet or the number actually active. But if the pre-registration is done and the mobile number was collected maybe months ago, that might actually, the number might be frozen, or the wallet might be frozen. That happened actually, and sometimes it's 10 to 15% of the total household that we register. So that is one of the challenges. With the registration doing just before the implementation, there are benefits with that. We don't really have any experience of leaving anyone of any of the community. But we have the benefits that we are actually covering all of them. If there are any new families join the community, as well as we can have the recent data. So that's what the benefits have. And as you know, being within the Red Cross, we have the huge capacity, the volunteers. That's what we are actually utilizing here, and we are collecting beneficiary information just before the implementation. Over. Phoebe.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Cairo, for that very concise answer. So Peter, we just have 2 final questions now to keep it very brief because of time. So we have Anita, who just clarified her question. You mentioned a lack of resources as problematic once you had done all the registration. So is this now less of a problem now that you have the now you have the EAP linked to the FPA by the draft? I think that is in reference to your flood EAP and the funds having been disbursed for readiness and prepositioning. And then there was also another question from Charles. I think the question by Melanie was already answered in terms of the migrants and any groups, for example, undocumented migrants. We had the question from Charles. Most national single registries in EA are not updated regularly. For example, the household size. What steps do you take to solve such a challenge? Briefly, Peter.
Yeah, thank you. And very correct, very accurate questions and pertinent questions. To Anita, less of a problem, yes, but there still remains a problem because remember, there's only so much that can be covered under the draft. There's a percentage that is covered. So if there's a larger scale, then it would still be a challenge. But yes, it narrows the gap. To answer your question, it narrows the gap. To Charles's question, correct. What we have done at the Kenya Cash Working Group level, deliberately, and I remember driving this as a co-chair, was the formation of a targeting sub-working group that we wanted to be deliberate to work with the Social Protection Secretariat so that regularly we can have mechanisms to update whereby partners now can collect their data. There's a complementarity platform that should address this, whereby regularly we are checking the data, updating the data, and reviewing the data. So we are seeking to address that through a targeting sub-working group.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. I wish we'd had more time for more questions and answers, but we don't have more time, so I will hand over back to you, Maya. Thank you so much, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Phoebe, for that, and everyone really, both for the activity and everything coming in on the chat, and not least, of course, to Peter and Cairo for joining us and sharing your experiences here. Have a look in the chat before you drop out of the meeting. There is a link to the Google Drive, which I've also shared on email, where you will find the Q&A sheet. We'll try to populate that with answers to the questions, so you have them, and you can also find the questions that were asked in the last session with the answers. We also still would love to hear from you on the homework. We only have 3 people who have responded there, so that's at the very top of that sheet. So I guess we will have a little bit of homework for next week as well through that. I've also put in the slides from last week, and I'll put the slides from this week into the Google Drive. I'll send it all to you with a link to the YouTube recording of this meeting as well. Next week, we have the last session for now. We can definitely look at whether there is an appetite for us to continue, if there's something we've missed in these sessions. So next week, the session will focus specifically on the draft for imminent crisis, on cash in national society contingency plans and how this links to early action. That will be quite brief. And next week, we really want to have all of you working a little bit more. So we will come up with a small case study where we will try to utilize things that we've learned in these first couple of sessions. We'll, of course, present those, and we'll maybe try and recap a little bit on what's missed and what would be your requests for follow-up sessions. So really happy to see so many people that showed up again for the second session in this learning series. We hope to see you all again next Tuesday, same time, same Zoom link. And I think that's it for now. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.